All right, welcome everyone. If you're joining for the first time, my name is Zoe. I'm here in Denver, Colorado, like some of you are as well. Um, so we're going to get moving a little bit today, but the focus, the habit is actually how to make your sitting better. So I know we hear a lot, oh, sitting is so bad for you and that kind of thing. And yes, what we've been doing is, hey, even when you're sitting, here's some stretching and movement that you can do. And here's how to maybe take some more breaks and get up out of your seat and do some moving that's really gentle and easy to do in an office or on the field. But sometimes we can help our sit just in how we sit in our desk. So I'm going to show you, we'll start with that. We'll play and move through the sits bones. If you have a blanket, towel, sweater, yoga block's too big, you could probably use a book to do this. Grab that because we might use a little bolstering under our sits bones to make sitting easier in a chair. And just, I want to say kind of ahead of that, I know there's a lot of ergonomic chairs out there that give you the lumbar support, and that's great for when you're sitting back in a chair and having the lumbar support and being able to kind of sit tall. A lot of times though, we end up kind of slouching into that, right? That tail tuck. This chair is not ergonomic, but I don't use it as its own thing. And get far enough back. So the tendency is, even if we're in an ergonomic chair, is to kind of lean back and do our work a lot of times. And what I'll say in general, and what we've been sharing, is that it's not about one position being bad and another position being good. It's really about how long you're staying in any given position that becomes problematic. So if you're standing all day without variety for your feet and without a little movement, that might be hurting you. If you're sitting in the same position all day with your tail tucked, that's going to bother your back. And there's a lot of things that come from that. So having variety even in your chair might be nice. Let's start with a little bit of movement in your chair. And I would invite you to sit a little further forward, even if you have an ergonomic chair. Sit forward so you can feel your sits bones. And I would invite you to do this sometimes. So it's not always collapsing into support, but sometimes you have your own body supporting you, right? It's built to support you. Play with that tuck in tilt that we practice sometimes, playing around with your sits bones. If you're on a soft chair, it's sometimes harder to feel the bones that you're kind of rolling forward on, and then you get to perch up really high on, and then kind of collapsing backwards on, and then rolling up to the tippy tops, and then kind of go forward a little bit and tippy tops and rolling back. And just play with a little bit of that tuck into tilt, but you're really feeling the bones, those two bones that you can kind of roll forward over and roll back behind, and noticing the top of that hill before you collapse down, and the top of the hill before you kind of push really far forward, right? So finding that, knowing where your sits bones are. We'll also take a little side bending from here just to move in our chairs. Let's take an interlace of your hands. We're going to get more into your hands and fingers shortly, but to kind of start previewing that, there's a lot of ways to do this, but we're going to really stretch your fingers. So there's that press forward when you interlace your hands. Most of the time people are pushing at the wrists. I want you to take that further and push your fingers into that stretch and open your thumbs really wide. Yep. And you can take that overhead a little bit. It's going to be a big pull. You can take that overhead a little bit. Drop your ribs. Notice how your ribs want to pop up like that. Can you drop them down? Your arms are going to be slightly in front of you, probably, with your ribs dropped, sitting on your sits bones. And then from there, if it feels okay, you could take a little mini side bend. Nothing that hurts you, but just you breathe into that side space of the rib cage. If your fingers need a break, let them take a break, right? Fingers might need a break in there. But take a big side stretch, breathing into the side ribs. If you need to take a hand down to remind your ribs. that they could have some open space there. You can do that. If you ever want to go back into the finger stretch to do the other side, you can, but it can be a lot. So going in and out of that finger stretch is great. Playing with something different. Maybe you pull a hand, maybe you just take a hand to the ribs. Find that big, like almost like when you're about to sigh, you take that big breath that really fills all of the little pockets where you're going to hold that oxygen in your lungs. Right? Your lungs are not just big bags of air, they're lots of little tiny bags of air. And sometimes they get a little collapsed on themselves. So those big breaths to sigh, fill them all up. So then you have access to all of them. Good. So to set up your sit, let's do a couple of our other things that we do to open up the sits bones. If you do this all the time, great habits. Hopefully these are starting to work their way into your life. Finding a little on your feet. You could have forearms on your desk, your chair. The back of your chair, if it's wobbly, isn't actually ideal, but the desk is great for this. And for our purposes today, really opening your tail. So heart open, tail open and lifted as much as your hamstrings allow, right? This is really tight for some of us. You might have to be up high in order to let that heart and tail stay open. Sometimes when we get down here, it gets really tucked under. So you can also start to bend your knees. So we call the straight leg version our happy hamstring stretch. Right? If you've been around, hopefully this has worked worked its way into your life somehow. And then the bending and straightening from there. And hopefully this is something, again, I try to wear some clothes that like these are regular pants. They're not fitness pants. They do have an elastic waistband though. So it's a little bit of a cheat, but it's nice to have that space to kind of move your hips. This is me in a dressing room trying on any pair of pants. If I can't do this, they're out. Good. So a little bending and straightening, opening that tail, just making your hips get a little, or helping your hips get a little space, a little movement. Good. All right. Once you're there, it's going to be a little easier to find your sits bones in sitting. But I want you to, especially if you're at home and if you have access to something, I'm going to use a little blanket. So a couple things that need to be okay for your sitting. Number one, your feet ought to be able to be on the floor. So if your feet are not touching the floor, I just worked with someone who, even with the office chairs all the way down, her feet were not on the floor. So we just had to bring the floor to her and have blocks or books, something under your feet if they're not going to touch the floor, if you can't get low enough. The other piece for being able to perch on your sits bones and kind of have a relaxed stack to work. Notice it doesn't always feel as released. Try the difference between kind of sitting down and sitting tall. And it might feel a little grippy in your hip flexors. It might be a little harder to feel like you're upright. And if you have a little bolstering, then it could just be a folded blanket. Something that helps you to feel a little bit more perched on your sits bones with ease. Two different things. One is just the height, getting a little bit of height and a little bit of softness is helpful. And then, for typing, for sending emails, for bits of time where your core system could just kind of feel lightly supported and stacked. Your shoulders don't have to do anything. Your neck can be floating on top. It doesn't have to be. When we lean back, the neck is often forward and we get a little stuck there sometimes. So being able to be perched with more ease in the hips slightly above your knees is going to be really helpful for that, with feet still on the floor. Again, is this all the time? No. Let's do a little twisting while we're here and supported. If you've got that bolster, just do it in your own way. You can look back behind you. The only thing I ask is that your ribs in the front get to settle down into the core space and your kidney space has room to breathe, right? If you crush it by popping your ribs, there's not a lot of room. So dropping those ribs into that cylinder so you can bring the whole thing with you in your twist. You can take a few breaths in there. That's another way to find room to breathe. And again, it might be a little easier to feel stacked while you're up on your bolster. Same thing to the other side. And then next I'll show you a little cheat if it's really hard to stay on your sits bones still, even with the bolster. If your pelvis is not used to being in this more upright position and it still feels like work, I got a cheat for you. Good. All right, the cheat is, and this only really works if you are using a blanket, but you can kind of make give yourself a little extra support right behind your sits bones that almost tips you into a more neutral spot. So you can kind of build a little extra padding right behind your sits bones, like a little bit of a roll, and see if that helps you just hang out in that more upright place rather than the rocked back place, right? It just gives you a little lift, a little support. Ideally, it's not pushing you into this huge curve, but just there's a low back curve there. It does go in. Your ribs can drop down and settle on top. And see if that helps you to feel minimal effort, right? People tend to, I was always a dancer, so I always was at least sitting up tall. It wasn't great posture and alignment, honestly. It was more of this rib talk. But people would always comment, oh, your posture is so good. I can't do that. It's too hard. And usually it's because the bottom part was set up to be falling back this way. And my habit was a little bit more open hips and sits bones grounded. And that's it. If the pelvis is in place, do you see how everything else kind of stacks a little bit easier? Do one more twist in this new, if you've got the extra lift behind you, just do one more twist and take a couple breaths here. Length through the spine. Eyes can be part of that twist, looking in distance. We'll focus on that at some point too, but having an eye break where you see far away from you, very important. Same thing to the other side. Again, still with this kind of easy, it's a bolster to help your pelvis feel more comfortable in this upright position, which might feel very new and different. It depends on what you've been doing. It might feel very new. And it's part of this idea of keeping the pelvis nice and open and unlocked. Do you have to be that way all the time? No, not at all. But it is a way to take some time, right? To take some time during your day. We've talked about sitting on the floor to do some work, maybe at home, but this is a way to kind of have those open sits bones and practice an easeful stacking of your ribs right over your pelvis, where it doesn't take a lot of work, right? Just a little bit easeful. And just play there for however long it feels comfortable. When it stops feeling comfortable, you would get out of it. Right? Okay, perfect. I know Megan had to run. Let's stand up and play a little bit more with any questions on that so far. Did you feel a difference between kind of sitting down and having a little perch to be open in your sits bones? Is that making a little bit of sense? Yeah. So it's just an option and not all the time. Usually when I come into people's office situations and mess with how they're doing the things that they're doing, that's one big one that we work with. If you have your towel or blanket anyway, that's going to be a good one to just jump into the calf stretch. Another one that I hope has kind of started to make its way into your world pretty easily. There's so many tools you could use to do it. I'm using this rolled up towel, the same one that I was using as a bolster to sit. So the front of the foot is on the, could be that half dome roller, the rolled up towel blanket, and the heel is on the floor. And you're just slowly kind of walking your other foot forward. I'm still kind of nursing this. I sprained this ankle a little bit a couple weeks ago. Anyway, still getting that range of motion back here. So I'm going to go easy on it, and one leg's going to be behind. This bolster idea is great for making chairs that are not super ergonomic, that kind of put, a lot of chairs these days encourage that like slumping tuck, which is just not ideal on every single level for your hips, for your back, for your knees, for everything. switch sides when you're ready. And you're just gonna hang out there, front of the foot on your whatever device of choice, hang in there. So if you run into a situation where you're not at your normal workplace and it's not, you keep blaming everything on the chair, we do that, right? No, I just need a better chair. You can work with the chairs that you have and make them a little bit more conducive to that vertical open pelvis. Sometimes, right? Not all the time, but sometimes. So that even the sitting that we're doing in offices, at meetings, maybe it's weird at meetings to sit on something, I don't know. Finding places for it that make sense to you. Good. And let that go. Come back to your happy hamstrings for just a moment. It doesn't hurt to do it more than one time. I always tease my mom for saying it's like for going on a walk or something. You want to go on a walk? Oh, I already did that today. I was like, you can't walk a little bit more, really? So same thing with the hamstring stretches and all of these stretches. They can happen many times throughout your day. It doesn't have to be just once. Your chair can become a little bit more of a playground, right? Rather than a cage. Because if we use the chair for only the things that it's meant for, it does become a little bit of a cage that we put our bodies in. So maybe even after this class, as we let go, maybe set up your new experiment with a new situation. Again, towel, could you have a little bit more kind of up behind the sits bones to help hitch your sits bones up to that vertical? Does it feel good just to have a little height and settle in your bones there? So I encourage you to today, right now, whatever you're doing after this, if you're sitting in a chair, experiment for yourself and see if you can find a place that feels settled in and lovely, in a place of ease where you are just kind of hanging out in a stacked, easeful place rather than the kind of becoming one with the chair, which we sometimes sink into. So experiment. And then next week, maybe you can let me know, share this idea with some friends and do a little, I don't know, test. Let me know what's different and let me know what happens. All right. Any questions before we go? No.
Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paula. Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, Zoe.
See you next week.
Yeah.
Bye.